I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, and I am very hot.
And I'm Matt Bernico, and I'm also extremely warm. I'm hot. I think I'm hot.
Yeah, it's a hot one.
It's a hot one. I'm down here in Missouri, and it's too hot. It rained a lot today, and it's even humid. And this has been the Magnificast weather report.
That's right. Up here in Ontario, still also very hot, pretty humid. It's supposed to rain this week, so we're all just anticipating that. I should say it's Ontario hot, which is to say 80 degrees. For other people, that is not hot at all. But for me, holy cow, is it hot? I'm sweating right now, and I don't like doing that at all.
Yeah, 80 degrees. I don't know. I think that's too hot. My son, he's always wearing a Darth Vader costume, like 24/7. He's always got it on. And lately I've had to work very hard. My wife and I have had to work very hard to convince him that he needs to take it off before he goes outside, because you can't wear a Darth Vader costume when it's like 95 degrees out. It's just as bad. It's not good.
That's good. Well, one of these days he'll figure it out, whether through diplomacy or the hard way.
I'm gonna have to blow up his Death Star to get him to take that costume off.
That's right. Well, we're not talking about the weather this week. We are we're continuing some conversations we've been having the last couple of weeks about Christianity and Marxism and how Marxism can help Christians avoid some pretty bad unforced errors, I think, when it comes to thinking about politics and capitalism and labor and all that kind of stuff. Before we do that, though, there's a lot going on in Minneapolis right now, which is based on the police murdering a black man named George Floyd. We are not going to talk about that this week, obviously. We have some other plans, and I don't think, the best people to really be paying attention to talking about it anyway. But all that to say, it's something that should be on your radar, and you can find all kind of info about that online and elsewhere. Probably you know already if you listen to this podcast, but we just thought it's important to at least mention. Anyway, what we are talking about this week is how Christians have tried to talk about labor, especially in light of this pandemic, which has brought them to all kinds of bizarre conclusions about unemployment and how labor works and how working works. And Matt has done some extremely hard work researching the very worst takes that you could find.
That's right. This week we're going to do something we did last week, but with labor rather than political economy. In the midst of COVID-19, it seems like everyone is a labor reporter, even evangelicals on the Gospel Coalition website. I dug in there this week, and I found a lot of gems. The kind you don't want, though. What's interesting, though, you can, in past episodes, I've said that, you can everywhere you look is just labor articles during COVID-19, because that is an extremely contentious issue. And what's wild, though, is that a lot of these like Christian outlets, Gospel Coalition or even like Christianity Today or whatever, not a lot of takes on labor, which is, I think, really sad and bad. But if you know where to look, you can find how they've transformed the energy around labor reporting into something wildly different. So instead of talking about like labor struggles and union drives and strikes and just all the rest of it. Christian writers and journalists in the sort of evangelical bubble have found some extremely individualistic and bourgeois rhetorical routes for talking about labor, mostly focusing the conversation on unemployment and how Jesus still loves you anyways. Yikes. I wish that was just like a mean caricature of their position, but it's not. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at how evangelicals are dealing with the mounting stress of massive unemployment. Like, it's been a bit since I've checked the numbers, but earlier this month it was like 1 in 6 Americans have filed for unemployment. So there's just tons of people without work at the moment. I'm sure that's kind of changed now that most of the stay-at-home restrictions have relaxed in a lot of different states. But who knows? There's also this a huge recession that is happening now and more looming on the way. So Christian writers and journalists are just having a whole hard time figuring this thing out. So last week, we're going to offer up what Marxist analysis has to offer Christians in hopes of making them just a little bit better at understanding the world. It's not like they're going to be listening to this podcast, but I think it's helpful to get some of these ideas out there, because they're, the basic and most essential ideas about labor from Marxist theory that I think you can find. So all here it goes.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, also we should say, okay, we're obviously going to dunk on these very bad takes, but the purpose of the episode, in general, is to just continue that assumption that Marxism does kind of help you get your head around things in a way that can say more than Jesus still loves you if you're unemployed. I mean, Jesus does still love you if you're unemployed, but also Jesus wants to abolish capitalism, so different conclusions. Why don't we start out with our old friend Joe Carter? For folks who don't know, Joe Carter is not somebody you have to know, but he's a libertarian Christian guy. He wrote for this very bad place called the Acton Institute. He also writes for the Gospel Coalition, and he's a capitalist economist, and his job is to explain to Christians why they should be capitalists, how capitalism works, etc. For the Gospel Coalition, he wrote an FAQ article called What Christians Should Know About Unemployment. It's a pretty goofy article because it is literally just like a bunch of copy-pasted information, it feels like, about like how unemployment works and what it is and its statistics. I mean, it's baffling that there's not a sentence that's like Webster's dictionary defines unemployment as. But anyway, that's the level of analysis here. Maybe we could just pull out a few juicy passages here and talk about kind of what they represent. So Joe Carter at one point asks, why should Christians care about unemployment? He says, the account of creation in Genesis tells us that from the beginning, humanity was created to work. God puts Adam in the garden to work it and keep it. And he goes on to say, by serving our neighbors, we use our time, talent, and skills in a way that honors our provider and leads to human flourishing. Because jobs can serve the needs of our neighbors and lead to human flourishing both for the individual and communities, they are the most important part of a morally functioning economy. Yikes. And because jobs are important for human flourishing, it's like find a thesaurus. Unemployment should be a primary concern for Christians. Conversely, not having a job can adversely affect spiritual and psychological well-being of individuals and families. Unemployment can have negative effects on communities, families, and a person's subjective well-being and self-esteem. And so all of this leads Joe Carter to conclude long-term unemployment is not just a mental health crisis, it's also a spiritual crisis, and the church is the only institution in America that can adequately respond. Helping people to find work that is uniquely their own and contributes to the flourishing of the wider community should therefore be one of the chief economic concerns for the Christian community. All right, Matt, how does Joe Carter's entry into the Christian concerns about unemployment strike you?
It is bizarre, I think, to say the least. Before I tell you exactly how I feel, let me also tell you this, that in this FAQ article, first of all, it's nearly unreadable because it's just like facts about unemployment. But this is like buried like 3 or 4 paragraphs in, like under all kinds of facts about who you need to call and like what person you should get in touch with your state. Like just wedged into this article is this like weird thing about like this weird theology of labor. But all that aside, yeah, I mean, I think this is so okay. It's bizarre because Joe Carter's not wrong. It does have negative effects on your psychology, your psychological state, right? It's bad for your mental health to not have a job, but he never actually says why it's bad for your mental health. It's just that it is, right? And it's like, it's bad for your mental health because you're going to be constantly stressing about how to pay your bills and how to support your family, and like, what are you going to do, right? But like, the weirdest thing about this explanation of unemployment and why it's very stressful is that there's nothing in here about like economic stability. There's nothing in here about like, you know, like how you're going to meet your extremely material ends. Instead, Joe Carter jumps to this like extremely extremely like just weird stuff about how this is going to affect your spiritual life and your psychological effects, but never to the material cause of these things. And it drives me absolutely crazy. So I think that's a huge problem for Joe Carter. But I also want to say too that I think that even though these are from the Gospel Coalition, I didn't just pick these articles because they were like low hanging fruit and easy to just dunk on. I think that even what Joe Carter is saying here is probably not that far off from what you'd hear other places too, right? That people at church aren't quick to talk about your whole money situation. And I think that what Joe Carter is doing here is probably not uncharacteristic of the way that a lot of sort of evangelicals would deal with the problem. So it's frustrating because it completely ignores the material situation. And I think that it's kind of on par for the way Christians talk. What do you think, Dean?
No, I think that's right. All of what you said is right. The thing that you brought out that I think sticks with me too is that for Joe Carter, unemployment is really a sort of psychological and spiritual problem. But it seems like a very kind of, what you'd expect, I guess, from a certain libertarian perspective. It's a pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, right? That being unemployed is depressing because it makes you feel bad about yourself. Because, of course, it would be your fault if you didn't have a job. So there's all these kind of really weird pathologies that I think are sort of unsaid, like evangelical ways of seeing oneself and other people. That enable this strange kind of overlooking of maybe the material concerns or effects or causes even of unemployment in general, which I think is just I don't know, like, obviously it's bad because you want to understand the full situation, but it's also the worst kind of thing that Christianity often does, evangelicalism in particular, is it speaks the language of compassion, you know, like, oh, this is a mental health crisis. But really what it's doing is using that language to cover over all the kinds of questions you should ask as a compassionate person, which is, you know, like, why do people feel depressed when they're unemployed? Well, because we have an extremely predatory and dangerous economy, right? That's a life or death situation if you have a job. So anyway, yeah, I think that's the thing that really is driven home for me by Joe Carter's FAQ here.
Yeah, one more point maybe at the end that we can draw out here too, that I think this isn't necessarily a good one, just a weird one. So in the last paragraph that you read, that sort of concludes the section on why Christians should care about unemployment. Joe Carter says that, you know, unemployment, it's not just a mental health crisis, it's also a spiritual crisis. And then he says, and the church is the only institution in America that can adequately respond. Helping people to find work that is uniquely their own and contribute to the flourishing of the wider human community, therefore, should be one of the chief economic concerns of the Christian community. And it's like, what in the world are you talking about? Like, the church is probably not adequately equipped to help people find a job.
Yeah,
it's just not. Like, is there anyone there that's going to help you, like, with your resume? I mean, maybe if you asked them, but like, I don't think I'd want that. You know, one time, this reminds me. One time, like, it was like one summer when I was in high school and I didn't have a summer job. My mom talked to this person at church who ran the local TBN, like the Christian TV channel station. And she was like, I think just trying to get me out of the house. So she talked to this person at our church who like worked there and was like, hey, can you give my son an internship there? And so like one day out of the summer, I went to go like check out what was going on at this weird ass Christian TV station. And I never went back because it was so absolutely disgusting and like cringeworthy. It was just like a call-in Bible show. Plus it was all in Spanish. Yeah. And my mom, I think, just like hoped that that was going to be what got me out of the house. And listen, it wasn't, and I'm not going to. I'm never leaving the house, Mom. Sorry. Anyways, yeah, people at church are probably not the first people I'd go to find a job.
It's also like, even if they were, they're not gonna like find you a job that's like just and fulfilling, right? First of all, because there aren't even necessarily that many of those jobs around. But the primary goal here, I assume, if Joe Carter, let's say Joe Carter was like, I'll help you find a job to a church member, the primary goal would be to just get somebody a job, right? To sort of fill that immediate need. But again,
Right.
it would be through that sort of bootstraps mentality. It would be heightening the feeling of desperation and anxiety rather than trying to find somebody some kind of dignified workplace.
All right, boom, roasted. Let's do the next one. So Joe Carter, he's out of the way, but here's another article from the Gospel Coalition that I think is actually really funny, but for all the wrong reasons, which I think is the case for most of these, but whatever. So this is an article called "Can I Ask for a Raise at My Ministry Job?" by Greg Phelan. So some of these, the next few articles that we're going to talk about really quick, they all come in the form of these questions that like Gospel Coalition readers, I guess, are sending to these folks. I don't know. Anyways, so the question that someone out there is asking Greg, someone who I'm sure is real, they ask Greg, "It's been a long time, years since I've had a raise. I work for a Christian organization that doesn't have a lot of money, so I feel bad asking. On the other hand, I'm starting to feel a little resentful that I'm getting paid the same rate when my skills and responsibilities have grown. Is it ever legitimate for a Christian to ask for a raise? Is that putting myself forward too much? How can I do so humbly?" Oh boy. So Greg, he writes back to this person, who again definitely exists. "First, a Christian should absolutely feel the freedom to ask for a raise. I'm not saying that as an economist, though economics are surely on your side. Consider the following examples in Luke 10. Jesus sends out the 72 and encourages them to willingly receive hospitality from their hosts, for the laborer deserves his wages," which is a weird mishmash of things, and I don't think is it's a bad gloss, but I don't care. That's fine. And then he goes on to say, "If your employer is unable to pay you more, you can continue to work at your current wage, viewing it as your gift to your organization." Don't do that. "And those to whom you're ministering. Let Jesus' work for you bring contentment with what you have and give you delight and blessing in your workplace. Then you can humbly and freely ask for what your labor rightly deserves." Now, I'm really sold on this last sentence, but I don't think Greg and I would interpret it the same way. Yeah, I don't know. This is there's a lot of moving parts here, Dean. But what do you think about this? What do you think about Greg's suggestion to asking for a raise?
Yeah. So certainly, like you, I think yes, at some point you can humbly and freely ask for what your labor rightly deserves. The wild thing in here, I think, I mean, there's a couple. One is presuming again this kind of Christian pathology about service. That you're offering your labor as a gift, which is bad, not only in Marx terms, but also even in biblical terms, right? Like, I always think of that passage we talk about on the show regularly, James 5, where it indicts people who have held back the wages of their laborers, right? That's a biblical principle that laborers are entitled to wages and that the rich are going to get judged for not following through. Somehow Greg missed that one in a whole, like one of the very few places the Bible talks about wages. Yeah, I mean, the other piece here is that substitution of Jesus's work for your own work, I guess, or like your feeling that you deserve more, that Jesus should actually be a way of kind of just smoothing that over. I mean, where have you ever found like a better proof of Marx's indictment of Christianity than in a sentiment like that you give it all to Jesus and Jesus will make you feel great about working for a low wage. And maybe once you finally learned that lesson, you can politely ask for a little bit more.
Yeah, man, I have worked for a Christian organization in my life, and I would never suggest to anyone to think about giving your work to a Christian organization as a gift, because they will exploit you as hard as they possibly can based on that ideology. Don't do it. Don't work for free is a good just a good rule to live by.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
All right, let's burn through the last two and then get to the meat of this whole episode, which is Karl Marx.
I want to talk about Marx so bad. We gotta fire through these ones. Okay. Also, this is by a guy named Brad Larson, written very recently. It's called "Help, COVID-19 Left Me Unemployed." Another question that someone definitely did right. I was in the middle of a job search when COVID-19 turned the world upside down. Now I'm at home, trying hard to trust the Lord to provide and deeply worried about my economic prospects. What advice, practical and spiritual, would you give to someone in my situation? First of all, that's so sad that this is the person I decided to ask, because he's going to give them some bad advice.
Mhm.
So, Brad Larson, this is kind of like further down in the article, but I think it kind of encapsulates his general feeling. Unlike Joe Carter, Brad doesn't completely neglect the material, but he definitely doesn't talk about it in any sort of expansive way. So this is what Brad says. Jesus will protect you. I lay my life down for the sheep. John 10:14. If you examine your financial concerns, you will find a deeper worry underneath them. When we have money stress, we feel desperate and vulnerable. We feel alone, disconnected from the source of our sustenance. Feeling cut off from the flock, feeling exposed, this is right where the enemy wants you. If you are freaked out and stressed out about your derailed job search, you are tired and helpless and vulnerable, and isolated sheep is prime pickings for a wolf. I'm talking about spiritual warfare here, of course. Beware of the whispers of Satan. You're a loser. You never find a job. You're finished.
Hey, you idiot. There's no way you're ever going to get a job.
Hey, dumbass, check out your LinkedIn. Don't believe these lies. When you hear disqualifying thoughts during this time, take them captive and slay them with your hope in Christ. Remember that in Christ, you're an adopted child of God. Okay. So this sucks for some very obvious reasons. I hate the idea that the rhetorical turn here sounds really good, but is actually bullshit. If you feel like you're in financial trouble, if you're having concerns about money, what you're really worried about isn't money, but it's actually about all these other feelings that you have. I think that sucks ass, because no, when people are worried about money, I think they're actually worried about money. Like, have you actually ever talked to anybody who lives paycheck to paycheck? My dude, like, they care about like how they're going to feed their kids and how they're going to make rent. They aren't, I'm sure they do feel desperate and vulnerable and disconnected, and that I'm sure that's absolutely true. But like, they're also worried about their money, and if you gave them some more, it would change the situation for them. Holy shit.
I think also what's really fascinating about this is the spiritual warfare bit, obviously, because okay, there are like whispers of Satan, right, in a capitalist economy. But the lies that you're told are like, you deserve to be like in this crappy job, or like you deserve whatever job you're going to get. Like, those are the whispers of Satan that you have to find a way of combating the lies that you shouldn't believe. Which I think is just so bizarre that like for Brad Larson, the lies of Satan are the ones that are basically holding you back from getting that shitty job that you need to get.
Okay, one more from Brad Larson, just really quickly. I'm going to fire through this one.
Yeah.
So this is from another article from last month from Brad, and the question is this: I lead a small team at my company. I recently had to terminate someone for incompetence, and I had the hardest time figuring out what to say, despite the fact that this person has been coached and equipped and still fell short of our standard. I felt terrible to be the bearer of such bad news and guilty for sending them off without a source of income. I don't think I handled the conversation in the best way. How can I think in a biblical way about firing people? How can I do it in a way that speaks the truth in love? First of all, you're a psychopath. Second of all, let's get into it, Brad. So Brad says this. He thinks that there's a lot of reasons that firing someone is hard, and usually those reasons are existential questions about our self-identity and sort of like our interpersonal reactions and communications with people. So Brad thinks that like we don't like firing people because we're always afraid about like what that will mean for what kind of person I am, and that the person will hate us, and Brad does say too that he would be afraid about what happens to the person when they let them go. So that's at least good. But still, like, this is what Brad thinks is at stake in firing somebody, your personal reputation and stuff. So Brad goes on to argue this. that we shouldn't be afraid to fire people because of these 3 reasons. First, because of the work of Jesus on the cross, we can rest secure in our identities. Jesus paid our debt so we can become the children of God. With our identities secure in him, because of his adoption of us, big on that word, which is interesting to me, we have no reason to fear the reputation damage so long as we're acting in a God-honoring way. Okay, so that's the first thing. You shouldn't care about what other people think about you because you're saved by Jesus, even if you fire them. All right. Second, we have to act with great compassion, especially when firing somebody. Christians should count on other people more significant than themselves, and thus it's crucial that we seek to preserve the other person's dignity and show them great respect. So you got to be respectful when you fire somebody. The third one, and this is I think the worst one. Third, and this is the gospel truth that will help you sleep at night. God is the provider, not you. Who causes the rain? God. Who has, in infinite wisdom, allowed your organization to exist and prosper? God. Who has put the food on the table and the clothes on the back of you and the person you're firing? God.
No.
And he's not a zero-sum God. He doesn't depend on you to take care of people.
Brad,
it's a wild thing to say when, like, the Bible says literally the opposite. Isn't that crazy? Like, what are you thinking, Brad? Brad, what are you doing?
This is also just like, I feel like I mean, first of all, it's a great gospel truth that will help you sleep at night precisely because it will make sure that you never ask any hard questions in your life. How is like Raytheon, an arms manufacturer, one of the most profitable companies in the world? Well, that's just God. That's what God wants. How are drug trafficking crimes like really, really good? Well, that's just God. Like, God's up to it. It's not a big deal. Don't worry. God's got it in his infinite wisdom. It's like, I mean, always the problem with theodicy is bad, but it's especially bad when you start looking at it to confirm the way that you live your life and license doing bad things to other people.
This is like, okay, this is completely out of left field, but if you've listened to the previous week's podcast and the one before that, and probably the one before that too, Dean and I have been reading all these like wild books about pirates. And in them, sometimes there are these like religious characters that kind of come up, and a prominent heresy of the day was this thing called antinomianism. That was basically the idea that like Christians don't have to care about the law because God saved them already, and like, you know, there's grace and all these kinds of things. So like this led to all these like weird ass Christian sects who would like rob people, like Brethren of the Free Spirit, because they believe that like Jesus already has got their back. We don't need to worry about any of this. But like this is an absolute weird, but I think true expression of antinomianism, where you don't actually have to care about ethical things whatsoever. You just need to worry about how like God's already doing all these things, and it doesn't really matter if you do it because like God doesn't depend, or people don't depend on you. God's doing it all behind the scenes, and when I read the books about pirates, I think antinomianism is awesome because like it's like this really weird, really weird heresy. But here it's like, oh wow, this is extremely bad.
Yeah, though the irony is that this is actually like a hypernomianism, right? Because the premise is that God is the ultimate lawgiver and is just maintaining all the right laws, including the economic ones or whatever.
Oh man, good point. If I knew a thing about theology, I would have thought about that already, but I don't.
Yeah, maybe I only know that because I go to a Calvinist school. Not this kind of Calvinist, thankfully, but they are always pissed at these ones. So,
I mean, there's reason to be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've talked about evangelicals for half an hour, way too long than they deserve. It's now time to share the real good news, the gospel of Karl Marx. Marx, we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks, is a figure that Christians should pay more attention to, primarily because he helps us actually understand what's going on instead of giving all this bad advice and pretending that everything's fine when it super is not. We were thinking about how to deal with some of these kind of issues, and we could try to maybe like pick apart one, I don't know, like weird assumption that Joe Carter makes and answer it with Karl Marx or whatever. But instead of doing that, I think it's actually better to just talk through maybe some like basic principles in Marx on labor, and we'll kind of find the thread as we go. There's stuff about labor all over Marx from the very beginning all the way to the end. Some of it remains surprisingly kind of the same all the way through, which is pretty fascinating, although there's also development in Marx. There's also tons of debate on early and late Marx, but we won't get into it here. In any case, all that to say, labor is a persistent theme, and what happens to laborers, why capitalism needs labor and how it uses it, all those kinds of things are front and center for Marx. And I think actually the best place to start is with a pretty famous short essay that Marx wrote when he was very young in a collection that is usually called The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1848. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But it's a bunch of it's a lot of Marx's kind of early forays into political economy, trying to figure out how capitalism works, all that kind of thing. And whereas the late Marx is all about figuring out the kind of scientific processes of capitalism and explaining it to you in some dry terms, the early Marx is very rhetorically charged, and really kind of tries to draw things out in an interesting way. So I feel like that's a good place to start, and specifically with an essay Marx wrote on wages. So let me read a little bit and we can just talk through. So Marx says, wages are determined in capitalism through the antagonistic struggle between capitalist and worker. Victory goes necessarily to the capitalist. The capitalist can live longer without the worker than can the worker without the capitalist. Combination among the capitalists is customary and effective. Workers' combination is prohibited and painful in its consequences for them. Besides, the landowner and the capitalist can make use of industrial advantages to augment their revenues. The worker has neither rent nor interest on capital to supplement his industrial income. Hence the intensity of the competition among workers. Thus, only for the workers is the separation of capital, landed property, and labor an inevitable, essential, and detrimental separation. Capital and landed property need not remain fixed in the subtraction, as must the labor of the workers. The separation of capital, rent, and labor is thus fatal for the worker. The lowest and the only necessary wage rate is that providing for the subsistence of the worker for the duration of his work, and as such more as is necessary for him to support a family and for the race of laborers not to die out. Pretty grim stuff.
Super grim, yeah.
A very stark way of putting it, right? It's a lot of maybe economic terms that you might not be familiar with, but what Marx is basically saying here is that capitalists, because of the way that they make and have money in a society, can live a long time without a particular worker, whereas a worker constantly needs to make sure that they have a job because they don't have access to capital that can sustain them for very long. And their capital, the money that workers get is always being siphoned in all these other directions, right? By landlords or to pay your bills, and nowadays even more than back in Marx's time, your debts, things like that. And the big point here is that workers are in a uniquely precarious situation, one that becomes a life and death struggle for workers.
Yeah, man, it's cool. That's not cool. It's a cool thing to write, Marx. Thank you. I think what really strikes me too, though, about this is the last sentence about the only thing that's provided to a worker is a necessary wage rate that is necessary for the subsistence of the worker, and to support their family, and so that the race of laborers doesn't die out. I think that's interesting because, I'm thinking a lot about the minimum wage these days for job reasons, but I think it's interesting because of how that is, I think, still true, but also has this unique difference in 2020 than it did in 1844. Which there are a lot of differences, but this one in particular, I think that what's interesting though is that the wage rate that is provided for workers isn't even enough for the subsistence of the worker or their family, or to make sure that they can socially reproduce or whatever. It's less than that, right? And what's interesting though is that even though we've there's a 40-hour work week that's the norm, and you only work 6 days out of the week or whatever, still we found ways to fit more work into people's lives through the fragmentation of labor through all kinds of different things, right? It's extremely rare that somebody, not extremely rare, but it is common for someone to work one job and then have a side hustle as well, right? Because it's too hard to make ends meet otherwise. So I think what's interesting is that subsistence isn't even assumed from one job anymore. Instead, you have to sort of get your subsistence, eke it out from two different jobs at least.
Yeah. Strangely, I mean, there is a bit of that in Marx's time too. Like one story that I always think about in the European labor movement in the late 19th century. This is from Mike Davis, but he talks about how like there was this weird gender divide within the labor movement because men and women were both working in a lot of places, but the men were advocating for like a wage given just to male workers that would allow them to provide for their entire family, not have their wives go to work. And the women were like, no, we also want a raise, but we also want to stay in the workforce. So there's this really bizarre, like, gendered kind of difference. All that to say, things weren't so good back in Marx's time either. But the point is that providing the subsistence for the worker, again, that's always like the very, very bare minimum that a capitalist is willing to part with. Which in the case of especially industrial capitalism often meant people dying. You know, it wasn't a subsistence wage.
That all ties, I think, into a theme that runs throughout all of those evangelical essays, blogs, or whatever you want to call them, right? That Marx has something that they're all missing out on, and that is necessarily that, like, well, I mean, first that there is a certain type of power in labor that the capitalists can't live without, but also it's a clear and like rhetorically strong way to just like lay out that workers actually work for money, not because of their mental health.
Right.
Not because the devil's whispering into their ear.
And your mental health isn't that great when you have a job either, because of this very process. But we'll say more about that in a minute. All right, let's move on to another moment in the Manuscripts, a different essay. But I really like this point that Marx makes, and I wanted to draw it out, especially because I think it helps us get a handle a little on some of the dynamics in these evangelical essays. One thing I love about Marx is that he's constantly complaining about how capitalists assume all kinds of things that they never get around to explaining, and that refusal to explain licenses all kinds of bad stuff. So Marx noticed this already in 1844 when he writes this. Political economy starts with the fact of private property. It does not explain it to us. It expresses in general abstract formulas the material process through which private property actually passes, and these formulas it then takes for laws. It does not comprehend these laws, that is, it does not demonstrate how they arise from the very nature of private property. Political economy throws no light on the cause of the division between labor and capital and between capital and land. When, for example, it defines the relationship of wages to profit, it takes the interest of the capitalist to be the ultimate cause. That is, it takes for granted what it is supposed to explain. Similarly, competition comes in everywhere. It's explained from external circumstances. As to how far these external and apparently accidental circumstances are but the expression of a necessary course of development, political economy teaches us nothing. We have seen how exchange itself appears to it as an accidental fact. The only wheels which political economy sets in motion are greed, and the war amongst the greedy, competition. Again, lots of kind of jargon here. I'll just explain a couple. When Marx says political economy, what he specifically means in this context is capitalism. In other places, when he says political economy, he just means thinking about how, economy works and how politics is involved, etc. Here he's talking about capitalist political economy in particular. So hopefully that helps a little bit. But the real key, I think, is what Marx is saying is people like, let's say, Joe Carter or others, they take for granted what is already happening under capitalism, and then they say that must be a sort of natural way of doing things and a natural economy. Whereas what Marx wants to do is dig one step below and say, well, what are the kind of decisions that people have to make in order to get going in this process? What kind of relationships have to be sort of foisted on to people to make sure that this process continues the way that it does? And I think that's a really important point, because otherwise you end up saying things like what these other Gospel Coalition entries say, namely that basically God is in control, right? That like these processes are all being directed by God because they're sort of natural. On the contrary, they are profoundly produced. And it actually kind of made me think of that thing that was in the last Gospel Coalition essay we read, where the author says, God's not a zero-sum God. He doesn't depend on you to care for other people. Marx's point with capitalism is, well, capitalism actually does depend on you to keep it going. Mm-hmm. And if God is maintaining on all of this stuff, then God also depends on people being capitalist in order to keep capitalism going. So all that to say, it's a good point that Marx makes that a lot of people who talk about getting jobs or being capitalists, etc., they don't ever bother to really think that hard about how all this stuff works. They just sort of take it for granted.
Yeah, I think there's something really important about the way they take it for granted too. I mean, you said that it just seems like it's the natural order of things for capitalism to be there, but I think actually rather than it being the natural order of things, Joe Carter and I think some of these other guys definitely fall prey to this type of thinking too. It's a divine order, right? It's like it's not just like this is the way that it works because of I don't know. The natural order of things is because this is the whole reason God made people to work in this particular way, and I think that sucks so much.
Yeah,
but it's like
right.
it's a way to disguise the whole situation. That God made people to work in this particular way, so like definitely don't look under the hood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all sort of a distraction from the violence that has to be maintained.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about all these guys. They're so worried about the mental health of people who don't have jobs. Let's talk about what Marx thinks about the mental health of people who don't have jobs.
Yeah.
So from the Philosophic and Economic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx makes some interesting remarks about what he calls the alienation of labor, and I think when I was first reading Marx, these are some of the parts that were so striking to me because when Marx talks about alienation, I mean, if you've ever had a shitty job, this is basically what you've experienced. I don't know. I think to me, it kind of spoke to me because like this is, I think, real. I was convinced because it was something kind of similar, I guess, to what I felt. Anyways, Marx says this: what then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker. It does not belong to his intrinsic nature. Marx is using some gendered language here, but it's fine. It was in the 1800s, I guess. It's not fine, but whatever. It does not belong to his intrinsic nature that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but he denies himself. He does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It's forced labor. It's therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It's merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, that's good. External labor in which man alienates himself is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification. Lastly, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but someone else's, that it does not belong to him, that in that he belongs not to himself, but to another. All right. This is a great piece of writing that I think describes what it's like to work a very bad job or maybe, I mean, kind of any job when it comes down to it, but some are less bad than others, I suppose. Anyways, what is really interesting about this though is I whenever I read this, I'm struck by how like supernatural it is. It's like there's something else that's controlling your body for a little bit. Mm-hmm. You walk into your workplace and all of a sudden all of your wants and desires have to go out the door. You have to compartmentalize them in a different part of your brain. So for like, the next 8 hours, you can do a bunch of things that some guy wants you to do for a reason. It's just like, you're surrendering all of your actual feelings and thoughts to your job for a while. And isn't that the most strange thing in the world that like people willfully do this and we think that it's like good or this is like the best type of economy that we could possibly have? I don't know, it's just I think it's such a profound explanation of why work in capitalism feels so bad.
Yeah, I think so. It's good too because like we mentioned earlier, someone like Joe Carter will say it's a mental health crisis if there's a lot of unemployment because unemployment makes you feel bad, and that's true. There's some truth to that for sure. but also it's a mental health crisis for people to have jobs under capitalism at all. I think that is really profound. And it's a really interesting thing that Marx notes this already, again, in 1844. But it's crazy how much this kind of continues, right? Like, we haven't gotten better jobs to make us feel fulfilled or whatever. And like you said, Matt, like, it explains how you feel working a bad job. But there's also something about it that probably strikes you even if you have a job that you love. Namely, that if you don't own, if you're working for somebody else, all the value that you create, all that wealth that you spend all day working so hard to generate, at the end of the day, most of that is going to get pocketed by someone that isn't you, right? You've sold your labor, so all the value that you produce goes to your boss or whoever owns the company. And there's something about that, even good jobs that I've had where I've enjoyed working there or whatever, and I even like the person I work for, etc. At the end of the night, you're like sweeping the floor and you're ready to go home, and all you can really think about is how you didn't really even make all that money for yourself. Like, I'm not getting paid enough to do this, that kind of feeling. And I think Marx just does a great job drawing that out. It's a real feeling that everybody is hit with when you're working for somebody else.
Yeah, totally. I think what's really insidious too about the alienation of labor is the ways that we kind of like trick ourselves into not feeling those things, or like we let this is, I guess, just like maybe speaking from some past experience, but like larger observations about people and how they act. But we we trick ourselves into thinking that like our job is actually like what we want to do, or we like let it kind of consume our entire identity, so we don't really identify as people who are doing something for a wage, and we identify as people who are doing something because this is our life's passion. Kind of going back to that one bit from the evangelical article about asking for a raise, where it's like you should just you can give your labor away as a gift, as a service, as if like it's a way to talk yourself into alienating yourself more from your labor. Just don't even worry about the wage, just give it away, because it's like who you are, and like God gave you these gifts and you just give them away. Anyways, all I'm trying to say is that there's a way in which we cover over this type of alienation with a big false consciousness about who we are as people, and like what the actual relationship is between our labor and ourselves, and that's bad.
I think you're right. It is bad.
Pretty easy to do Marxist analysis when it's just all bad, huh?
Yeah, just find all the bad stuff, and there you go. You've done it. Well, as we kind of get close to the end, one thing I do want to talk about a little bit more is how capitalists get labor in particular, because I think it helps to figure out, just like why people have to get jobs and how they do. Because again, it just gives you a sense of maybe location of where you're at in the capitalist economy that these other folks don't have. So this is from Capital, which is a late work. So we've been talking about one of Marx's earliest pieces of writing, but this is on the other end. And nevertheless, I think it's really useful to figure this out. I'll also, in the last episode, I introduced the character of a Bible factory owner, Big Bob's Bibles, we'll call it. Bible Bob's Emporium, I don't know. Anyway, it's a great assembly line for making Bibles. I'm sure that's how they get made. And just think about that character as we go through this process. So Marx says, in order that our owner of money, that's Bible Bob, may be able to find labor power offered for sale as a commodity, various conditions must first be fulfilled. The exchange of commodities of itself implies no other relations of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can appear upon the market as a commodity only if, and so far as, its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. In order that he may be able to do this, he must have at his disposal, must be the untrammeled owner of his capacity for labor, that is, of his person. And the owner of money, he and the owner of money meet in the market and deal with each other as on the basis of equal rights, with this difference alone, that one is the buyer and the other is the seller, both therefore equal in the eyes of the law. The continuance of this relation demands that the owner of the labor power should sell it only for a definite period, for if he were to sell it rump and stump, once and for all, he would be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. He must constantly look upon his labor power as his own property, his own commodity, and this he can only do by placing it at the disposal of the buyer temporarily for a definite period of time. By this means alone, he can avoid renouncing the rights of ownership over it. The second condition to the owner of money finding labor power in the market as a commodity is this, that the laborer, instead of being in the position to sell commodities in which his labor is incorporated, must be obliged to offer for sale as a commodity that very labor power which exists only in his living self. Okay, tons of a little more scientific stuff going on here, maybe you could say, but it's not that complicated what Marx is getting at. What he's really describing here is similar to what we talked about earlier in the conversation about wages. There is a capitalist who needs to buy labor, and there's a laborer who needs to sell their labor power. I think what's particularly useful about Marx's explanation of this is how the person who sells their labor has to kind of retain this feeling of freedom that they are selling it voluntarily, and that they're selling it for a temporary period of time, that they could quit and go sell it somewhere else. Otherwise, they would be a slave. It's this kind of like extremely, in the one hand, marginal sense of dignity, but on the other hand, very profound sense of dignity when you think about what it's like for people to live as actual slaves, right? But nevertheless, it's still a shitty, meager kind of existence. And I think that's a really just fascinating piece that Marx draws out, that once more, the capitalist can live much longer without the worker. The worker needs to sell their labor for reasons that are more immediate than the capitalist needs to buy it. And so although they might be equal in the eyes of the law, they're certainly unequal in the actual situation of the market.
Yeah, there's like there's a type of social power that's not being recognized in these like weird classical types of economics, that like, you know, if a worker wants to just up and sell their labor somewhere else, it's actually a lot of anxiety, right? Like,
right.
You have to go find somewhere else to do it. You gotta, I mean, in 2020, it means like hopefully finding another place that has just as good insurance benefits, if any at all. You know, it's just all so silly when you put it in those terms, though, right? That like you could just go sell your labor elsewhere. It's like, well,
yeah.
I mean, not really. No, I can't.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, let me draw a little bit more out. I hope I'm not belaboring it too much, but a little more out from Capital on what happens once this labor is purchased. So Marx goes on to say a little bit more. He says, the labor process turned into the process by which the capitalist consumes labor power exhibits two characteristic phenomena. First, the laborer works under the control of the capitalist to whom his labor belongs, the capitalist taking good care that the work is done in a proper manner and that the means of production are used with intelligence so that there's no unnecessary waste of raw material and no wear and tear of the implements beyond what is necessarily caused by the work. Secondly, the product is the property of the capitalist and not that of the laborer, its immediate producer. Suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's labor power at its value, then the right to use that power for a day belongs to him just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse that he has hired for the day. To the purchaser of a commodity belongs its use, and the seller of labor power, by giving his labor, does no more in reality than part with the use value that he's sold. From the instant he steps into the workshop, the use value of his labor power, and therefore also its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. By the purchase of labor power, the capitalist incorporates labor as a living ferment with the lifeless constituents of the product. From his point of view, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodity purchased, that is the labor power, but this consumption cannot be effected except by supplying the labor power with the means of production. The labor process is a process between things that the capitalist has purchased, things that have become his property. The product of this process belongs, therefore, to him, just as much as does wine, which is the product of a process of fermentation completed in his cellar. So, let me break this down really quickly as well. Again, it's a lot of words, but the point is pretty simple. What Marx is saying is, once you've sold your labor power, which is your, just your ability to work, once you've sold that to a capitalist, it's theirs, and all the stuff that you produce with that labor is theirs. It's the same thing. Your labor is the same thing as a capitalist buying a horse for a day, right? They're equivalent in the eyes of capital. And at the end of the day, your labor power is one more commodity working with lots of other commodities in order to generate value. And I mean, to put it in maybe terms that might not be so natural to capital, but nevertheless I think are helpful, this, you might say, is a profoundly dehumanizing experience, right? That you're reduced to the level of one commodity among many others, and you don't even get to retain whatever value you create, whatever kind of profit you create by working for somebody else. So that feeds back into all that stuff about alienation, I think. It feeds back into that differential of power, but nevertheless, one more place where evangelicalism and Christianity in general just has a hard time recognizing, because we like to assume that everybody is kind of on the same playing field, or, you know, we're all treating each other with respect, and if you fire somebody, you better fire them with respect as well. But there is no way to really have respect for workers in a capitalist society, precisely because they're commodities among others. You might, you know, nicer bosses might be nicer to their commodities than others, but nevertheless, they're all commodified.
Yeah, you know, this is I guess it's interesting because, like, whereas Marx's explanation of the alienation of labor is like an explanation of what it feels like to work and to sort of like sell your time and your life. This is like the flip side, right? This is like the top down view of what it looks like to do labor. It's like the other side of things. So on the one hand, you know, you have the sort of like the terrible existential dread you feel when you're at work doing things like someone else is possessing your body, and then this end you have the like this is what it looks like from the side of economics. And yeah, I don't know, this is a consistent idea Marx has across time.
That's a hot take against Althusser for all those theory Marxists keeping score at home.
oh well, I guess. Yeah, okay. Well, let's round out the conversation then with a little bit more of Marx's hot take from the Communist Manifesto, from the chapter 2 on proletariat and communists. Marx here is talking a little bit about wage labor, and the Communist Manifesto is one of my favorite pieces of writing, not just because it's like good and smart, because it's rhetorically interesting and I love it. So this is a little bit here, and we can get into some of the same ideas, I think, but in a different facet, a different way. Marx writes, "But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? No, not a bit. It creates capital, that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor." He goes on to talk a little bit more about it, but I think there's an okay place to stop even. This is short, but it's Marx is explaining like the very basic building blocks that that are missing from like every account of labor we've talked about from these Christian Christian bloggers writing for the Gospel Coalition. You know, they don't even recognize, you know, earlier you were saying, Dean, that capitalism has all these unstated premises, but like and that's true, but like I think from this bit of the manifesto, what's clear too is that these guys don't even know like what work is, like what it does in terms of the grand scheme of the political economy. And man, Christians, you need to understand this one thing, right? That like you don't just work for no reason. You don't just work because God told Adam to work the earth, right? There's a whole reason to do it. And if you refuse to recognize that reason, like you are an unhelpful part of the capitalist system. Like you have to ask a deeper question to get to anything.
Yeah, it's also like, sure, people have to work, right? Like someone will have to do productive work, even in a social society, all kinds of productive work. But the fact that people have to work is not the same thing as saying people have to sell their labor to capitalists in order to work, which is a profoundly different question that isn't often asked, I find, by evangelicals or other Christians for that matter.
Yeah. If you want to know what it would be like to work in a communist or socialist society, you just got to keep reading the manifesto.
That's right.
Maybe that'll be another episode in the future, but not right now. So I guess what's the big VeggieTales, what did we learn moment here about these guys?
Right. I think that the big thing for me is, all right, if last week we were talking about how progressive Christians have trouble figuring out what's wrong with capitalism because, even though they're opposed to it, they can't really figure out how it works such that they could oppose it in a meaningful way. I think that these obviously more conservative Christian takes on just how to sort of deal with the fallout of capitalism repeat kind of a similar error, even though they're not anti-capitalists, which is to say, they rightly recognize there are all kinds of problems that capitalism creates, right? Unemployment is one, having to do really awful things like fire somebody, which is to remove their ability to take care of themselves financially, is another. There's all kinds of them, right? They recognize that those are bad under capitalism. They're not good, but they are willfully ignorant about why those things are the way that they are, and they paper them over with theological platitudes that basically are designed not to draw you deeper into, God's love for other people or whatever, but designed to make God's love into a sort of, the opiate of the masses in the most negative way, not even in the good way that Marx mentioned.
Right.
the ideology that actually blinds you from what's really happening in front of you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that... just think about, okay, so that's all true, right? These guys from the Gospel Coalition obviously giving very ideological answers. I mean, what more could you expect from them? But I think what sticks out to me is that we're Christians to understand labor in this like very precise way that Marx does, right? And I think that we can even get more precise because social science has advanced a lot since the 1800s, right? We can add more data. We can add sort of refined methods to sort of look at political economy. But I think if we could even get Christians to kind of understand the economy along these broad terms that Marx gives us from all these different writings, we could learn way better how to love other people, how to extinguish injustice from society. I mean, it would just be this huge systemic tool that Christians could actually use and wield to be politically efficacious. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do those things, then I don't know, you're just missing out. You're just missing out on all these opportunities to do the things that Christians ought to do. And I think that sucks.
Yeah, and you're missing out on figuring out, why you feel so miserable or why other people feel so miserable, right? There's a real, even sort of basic, self-interested piece of knowledge that you just want to be conscious about why you feel so bad under capitalism.
Yeah, totally.
Well, there you have it. One more in the books about why Christians should be Marxists. Who knows when we'll get back around to it, but I think sometime we'll have to do a little more political economy 101. I don't know. I hope it's been helpful, but I've actually really enjoyed going back to the basics. I feel like we've really dug back into the good word that is Karl Marx these last few weeks. We'll have to do it again.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you could also give us a nice review on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're using. I don't care. Just leave us a review. Even if your Spotify doesn't give you a space for reviews, and that's too bad. So if you're using Spotify, just go to Apple, iTunes, or whatever, and give us a dang review. Just do it, please. Cool. We have merch out there on our Redbubble store. That should be easy to find if you just Google it. That's probably a bad way to do it, but no big deal. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. Cool. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.